The 2017 protests at the Evergreen State College, which very faithfully prefigure certain aspects of protests that America underwent at large in 2020, those protests began on the Evergreen Class of 2020 Facebook page. Just this past weekend, the Evergreen Class of 2020 graduated, and their ceremony was held virtually due to a pandemic. One of the faculty speakers was Lisa Sweet, who was my first professor at the Evergreen State College. I took a program with her in 2013, in the winter of 2013, titled Iconoclasms, which was about the creation and destruction of images. In 2015, I witnessed my professor Lisa Sweet give a statement of faith to her colleagues in the form of a "This I Believe" statement.
Thanks, Felix. This I believe. Evergreen is a place that is as deeply implicated in perpetuating white privilege and white supremacy as any other institution. We inherited this system, and we unintentionally maintain it. We practice white privilege when white folks talk about including others. We silence voices of color when we say, "I don't see race," and all lives matter. When faculty aren't trained to address dynamics of inequality in classrooms, we expose students of color to oppression, and white students can't learn to examine their own racism and white fragility. We galvanize white privilege in the form of curriculum, exalting white canons of fine art, literature, theory, and scientific thinking, more so if we don't examine how those canons are made. I believe we are capable of unlearning the habits of mind that perpetuate white privilege. What I am uncertain of is our collective will to examine those habits. The other piece I want to just pick apart a bit is that white folks don't necessarily understand racism and our racism inside and out. And what I'm learning is this is hard for a white person, but I'm learning to imagine what it might be like to be a student of color and how they hear us and how they see us. And so I need to be really careful to say, I don't know what that experience is like, and I need to learn it. And so I get a little itchy when I hear faculty saying, yes, we have these protocols for identifying racism, when I'm pretty sure white faculty don't necessarily know what racism looks like. And we need to.
The white person can tell them so that they know. I mean, that's another example right there. No diss to what you say.
1 year to the day of the beginning of those protests, Lisa Sweet put up a series of icons on the Evergreen State College bell tower. These icons, or votives as she called them, were to explore relational aesthetics, and I'm going to read from her webpage that explains what this art project was about. During the academic year 2016 to 2017, anxiety and hostility on the campus I call home exploded. Some, not all, the details are elsewhere on the web. I would recommend you watch my thorough series on this matter. My own view is that 6 months of internal emails did far more damage than the events of May 23rd, 2017. Threats were made on specific students and the campus at large. It was impossible to teach and learn in that context. I have not seen, and I've done thorough research into this matter, I've not seen any threats made to specific students and the campus at large originating from within the email chains. Actually, Lisa Sweet led several group email chains in vilifying anybody who disagreed with the narrative that racism and white supremacy were dominant on the campus. As an artist, I make things in order to understand complicated invisible dynamics and phenomena. So in the year following unrest in the campus community, I retreated to the printmaking studio and spent the next 5 months reflecting and wondering what had happened. How did it happen? What would it take to initiate healing? Printing can be a relatively mechanical operation, and printing provided me time to think. Meanwhile, images piled up. More than 400 woodcuts of hands, eyes, hearts, and ears. Every time a block passed through the printing press, I felt like a prayer or blessing was produced. These were blessings made with the skills and materials I knew best, in a vernacular that had been tested and that had made the invisible visible. This labor was an offering to our students, staff colleagues, and community, whether they knew it or not. Now, I bring that up and I make this video to underscore what we're actually dealing with. We're not dealing with protests. We're dealing with theory. We're dealing with a new religion. Lisa Sweet is one professor of many that has tried to reestablish a religious sort of knowing within the arts and humanities. This religious sort of knowing was missing from previous ways of interacting with art. She goes on to say in her 2020 commencement speech that even religious symbols from the West were co-opted by museums and artists to strip it of a certain religious meaning.
While learning with Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and LGBTQ students, I began to imagine art history from their perspective. I began to wonder if the discipline I loved and relied upon was one more instance of Eurocentric colonialism. I questioned ideas of art as universal and apolitical. I examined the concept of aesthetic experience, and I discovered that the idea of art I learned and unthoughtfully perpetuated was not informed by the range of functions served by indigenous images and objects. Then, I discovered that even my own European visual heritage of Christian images had been assimilated to fine art. Devotional works intended to provide access to a spiritual realm were removed from the church communities they were intended for and placed in museums to serve exclusively as aesthetic experiences. Interrogating my discipline required two things. One, a range of intellectual tools beyond art history, knowledge of colonialism, political economy, cultural studies, medieval history, and religious studies. It required learning in community. The presence and resistance of folks with insights and experiences very different from mine.
One question that I have is if something was missing when the West, so-called, or Enlightenment artists attempted to make secular certain forms of viewing and participating with art. If that secularization of art led to a gaping, hollow wound of sorts where a god needed to be, or a spiritual experience was. If the humanities had attempted to scrub religiosity and religion and spiritual experience from the products of the West and of culture, are we now seeing a reversion back to religiosity, religion, and the spiritual experience framed in terms of oppression, framed in terms of race? You can see in Lisa Sweet's statements, both in 2015 and 2020, a racialization of the products of the West, a imposition of superiority on the products of her culture, and a prostration of her culture unto a sacred knowing that she herself has lost and is seeking now to regain by means of positioning the indigenous and the so-called person of color's experience as somehow more authentic, truer to form, and connected to reality than her own. Insofar as this is the case, that she is now operating from a position of belief, and that belief is taken wholesale from Robin DiAngelo, the inventor of white fragility and other anti-racist doctrines, we can see that Professor Sweet can read the protests in no other way than as an affirmation of her belief. She's already decided what any given phenomena means. She is no longer operating with actual intellectual humility, because behind that humility, which is a guise, I would argue, is the imposition of an interpretation on every single phenomena.
I was born into a racial hierarchy from the moment I opened my eyes, right? So that I could be born into, that I could learn, I could play, I could worship, I could study, I could love, I could work, and I could die in racial segregation, and not one person who's ever taught or mentored me has ever conveyed that I had lost anything. I'm going to say this a few times in a few ways, because this goes well beyond white privilege. It goes to my psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. This is what this is, white supremacy. White and whiteness as superior.
Everything, according to Robin DiAngelo and her acolyte, Professor Sweet, is about race, is about dividing people according to their race and assigning them authenticity or power or resources, both material for the whites and spiritual for the people of color, so-called. And in dividing people that way, they assume that they have a certain, shall we say, hidden knowledge, a certain received wisdom that they are graciously bequeathing unto students, unto their wards, their charges, and making little believers in the world. Believers that are chained to a belief that bills itself as liberatory.
I don't feel guilty. I'm not trying to make people feel guilty. I mean, if guilt motivates you, I'm okay with it, okay? And as a good Catholic, it does motivate me. If guilt paralyzes you, then you can't indulge in it, because then it's just an excuse, right? It's just that it's incredibly transformative and liberating to just start from the premise that, yes, I have a deep investment in racism. Of course I do. It's all I've known, and it works for me. And I don't want that, right? That's not okay with me. And if I'm going to sleep at night, I've got to actively, intentionally be always trying to interrupt it. The default is racism. The default is the reproduction of racism. That's what I tell my teachers. You just go up there, pick up the curriculum, and do your job exactly how it was laid out for you. You'll perfectly reproduce it, right?
My ultimate question is this. If aesthetics, so-called, that the Enlightenment humanities attempted to refine into some sort of removal from experience and effete engagement with lights and sounds and tastes and smells, if that removal has reached its end and provides the artist no more new ground to explore, if that is the case, is critical race theory the new ground? Is this doctrine Is this doctrine that proposes that superior whites should suppress their supremacy and prostrate themselves before more authentic, spiritually relevant people of color? Will that provide artists in the present day and in years to come with new untold vistas to map out with their creative energies? Or is it doomed to fail and become a religion that is even more removed from authentic experience? A religion that does not allow one to let go of their presuppositions, to merge with phenomena, and to freely invent playfully with whatever comes across their grasp, but always is searching to reify some sort of ancient knowing that whites, so-called, cannot have access to because the Enlightenment has stained them with knowledge. I myself have spent the last 3 years wrestling with the same phenomena that Lisa Sweet has wrestled with. Since I witnessed her say that white culture needs to be thoroughly, critically reevaluated and strained of its supremacy, since I watched the ideas that she espoused take over Evergreen and possess it with a spirit not of justice, but of vengeance. And you can see vengeance in hours upon hours of footage. That vengeance, according to the Lisa Sweets of the world, is justified and is necessary. Whiteness needs to be combated as the most violent system to ever breathe.
That's how whiteness works. Whiteness is the most violent fucking system to ever breathe. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that all of our administration is white. Yeah. Right. It's not an accident. That shit is systematic as fuck. So while we sitting up in here acting like this conversation is gonna change shit, y'all know what changes shit? Action. That's why the fuck we in this room.
And in that rush to purge ourselves of pretended guilt from sins of others that look like us, what are we actually surrendering? And what are we actually gaining in that exchange? By now you probably know my stance on the matter is to reject it outright. I am neither fragile, actually I can't be fragile. To accuse me of being fragile and privileged is beside the point, and is a way to diminish the power and the strength of my pursuit, which is to freely engage both with individuals and with artifacts to create more expansive, more potential engagement with my senses, with my spirit, with my soul, and with the soul, spirit, and senses of others. I refuse this new religion that prostrates itself as weakness, but really has such an air of superiority to it. Now, I may be wrong in my pursuit, she may be right in hers, or I may be wrong-headed and she right-hearted, and the only way to tell us apart is by our fruits, both the lives that we live and the art that we create.
Practice intellectual humility. You have demonstrated that each of us can learn from others, provided the learner is prepared to receive unexpected lessons. For example, in November 2016, Evergreen students, as members of the Equity Council, taught us that a forum can take the form of a holistic community-building event, not merely the academic concept of a forum, according to white folks.